name is Paul Barrow. Welcome back into Tech Path. It's going to be a good one today because we will talk about nation states and how that might be an influence on how Bitcoin adoption could start to take place. Obviously, digital assets as a whole. So we're going to bring on a special guest in a minute to kind of break that down. I do want to thank our sponsor today, and that is iTrust Capital. If you guys are looking to go into a crypto IRA or other IRAs, it has precious metals, gold and silver, a variety of options over there that you guys can invest in as a IRA. So check it out. Just go to itrustcapital.com. You can use our link down below. It's going to give you $100 in funding to get started. Joining me today is Diana Choyleva, who is the chief economist over at Enodo Economics. Great to have you on.
Great to be here.
Hi, Diana. So I want to jump into a couple of points real quickly. I want to go over to your Twitter account. And you had a nice little tweet stream here around the potential between the U.S. and China and what that might look like in terms of the political tensions, but also from an economic standpoint. Your first tweet there called President basically to elect Trump, to congratulate Trump, and basically said, hey, we're still looking at this as a competitive statement. Obviously, Trump has been very pro-tariffs and what that might look like going forward. When you look at the U.S.-Chinese relations, you look at the global economic condition right now of what we're seeing both in China, obviously here in the U.S. with our current, inflation, interest rates, et cetera. How would you grade this relationship going forward?
Look, the relationship between China and the U.S. is only likely to deteriorate further under Trump. We are in the era of the great decoupling, and this decoupling is set to accelerate when Trump comes to power. And this is just not only entirely related to the tariffs that Trump intends to impose, and in our view, he will start by imposing them and afterwards try and reach a deal of some sort. But the problem is that there really isn't anything that China could offer the US that could lead to some sort of even detente, let alone a lasting improvement in the relationship between what is essentially the existing superpower and the aspiring one fighting for who's going to be the global hegemon of the future.
Yeah, okay, so a couple of points there. Obviously, the relationship between the U.S. and China has become a little bit more tense, mainly around the lopsided trade deficits that go on between the U.S. and China. Also, some of the companies that would like to operate in China from the United States who are not necessarily allowed. Obviously, here in the United States, it's a little different. We're in the midst of a TikTok ban that's going to be happening, I guess, in about 60 days or so. Whether or not that's going to happen, do you feel like China could come back in and just look at the opportunity that sits in front of them and maybe loosen up the trade regulations between the two countries to maybe allow that a deal to be done?
Fundamentally, this is a clash of different ideologies and a clash between two superpowers. The spat started around trade when Trump first came to power, but it was China that first started decoupling, and its focus was on rising up the value-added chain and ensuring its self-sufficiency when it came to critical technologies, in particular the technologies of the future. So none of this has changed. And yes, Trump has sort of waved the carrot of, well, I might not impose tariffs if Chinese production relocates to the US. And in our conversations with some of the Chinese companies, they are preparing to make such investments. But the playbook will be basically China's playbook enforced on China this time around. Will China itself now be willing to share its critical technology, in particular when it comes to the electric vehicle sector, solar technology, areas where they're ahead of the game? So there is absolutely a widespread bipartisan agreement in the US to be tough on China. And it moved well beyond trade, which was in a way the symptom really rather than the root cause of all this, to this technological constrainment of China. And under Trump will move to also looking at investment flows in a much more robust manner. I would, joke often that, in our conversations with our US fund manager clients, we are in a, if they invest in China and they lose money, they're fools. But if they invest in China and make money, they're actually unpatriotic.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of this right now has kind of got back into a scenario that is playing out maybe around the globe. We've already started to see other countries starting to somewhat nationalize, try to bring more jobs back. Trump, of course, is talking to a lot of those types in general. But at the same time, I think the scenario that's going to play out around tariffs is going to be very interesting to watch. I want to go to a clip real quick. This is Geeta over from Bloomberg. She's talking about the IMF and a little bit of a shift that's occurring there. And I wanted to get your opinion on this. Take a look.
This question about regime change, and that some people are saying that we're entering a new paradigm where there is a greater acceptance of protectionism, of trade tensions, of this question about who's friends with who and who's going to scratch who's back, but not necessarily the same sort of free trade era. Do you think that this is the beginning, the middle, or the end of that evolution?
Well, we certainly have changed in the sense that there was a time when countries were hyper-focused on efficiency. And when they were deciding who to trade with, the only question was which was the cheapest source to buy it from. Right now, they're stepping back and saying, well, we need to make sure our supply chains are secure, that we are not exposing ourselves to big risks, that there are not big national security concerns. That change is already happening, and you see that in the data. But it's still of a small magnitude. The question is, how much further down the path do we go? And that, I think, is uncertain.
So a small magnitude there, you look at the scenario that could be playing out with the IMF and really how this could be reshaping the format of global currency. The dollar obviously as the world's global reserve right now, but this could start to shift with things like, what's happening with BRICS, et cetera. With that being stated, she's saying it's still very early. If you were to put a timeline on this where we do see some global shifts really occur, and if China does become the new superpower, what would be your time frame right now?
Well, look, this reminded me when I was participating at Bloomberg's New Economy Forum, the inaugural one in Singapore in 2018, and I was speaking at their big debate. They had a session on has globalization gone too far, and we had a pro and con camp, and I was in the pro camp arguing that globalization has gone too far for a variety of reasons, and we are set on this sort of deglobalization, great decoupling path, which will turn out to be the most fundamental driving force impacting absolutely everything. So we've been ahead of the game on this, forecasting this, and everything so far has unfolded exactly as expected. Sadly, in a way, obviously, because if Martians existed, they would be sitting on Mars looking at Earth and saying, why the hell are humans arguing when they've never had it as good as in the last 30 years? But here we are, and I tend to describe this decoupling really as an iceberg, and that by the time it hits you in the sense of the data, showing it in its full scale, it will be too late. A lot of the corporations, no one wants to take a side. The countries don't want to take a side. The multinationals, don't want to take a side. And everyone tries and have their cake and eat it. But simultaneously, certainly in particular as well, in our conversations, everyone is now preparing, and in particular post the invasion of Ukraine. Before that, it was more about tariffs, China's cost, where everyone was looking still under the prism of cost and benefit. And now it's the geopolitical considerations and the realization that you have to take on the higher costs. That's inevitable, that we are moving to a much less productive and efficient world. And that's what we've chosen to move across the board.
So with that being the case, and I think to your point, you look at how BRICS has risen so quickly to, I would think, a world stature, at least what we're seeing now with a number of countries starting to join BRICS as well. Vladimir Putin shares his BRICS plan, of course, obviously with Trump taking the office, there's a lot of political and policy shifts that are going to be occurring. One of the things that has been talked about, and we've talked about this quite a bit, is the BRICS dollar strategy. Some of it is gold. Most likely we'll see a lot more Bitcoin being utilized by nation states. We've already started to see a lot of accumulation in that area. Do you think that with BRICS in a position right now, 36 countries, greater GDP than G7, where does that go and how does that potentially destabilize things like the dollar itself?
We are in a period where the role of the dollar as payment currency, first and foremost, is in decline. And it's driven by the US actions as well, in terms of the severe financial sanctions that it imposed on Russia, and that really sort of rang alarm bells across the global south, more broadly speaking. Now, BRICS is an interesting grouping that doesn't, in our view, has the potential to create a kind of a certainly not a BRICS currency in any shape or form, but every single country in the BRICS grouping is looking to ways where they could use their own currency in their trade and rely a lot less on the dollar-based global financial system. Now, as it happens, the global US dollar-based global payment system, cross-border system, is extremely inefficient. And the developments with digital currencies, in particular central bank digital currencies, and their use for cross-border transactions offers incredible efficiency gains and cost gains. And there's various pilots across the world that have progressed to a minimum viable stage where this is really on the cusp of being utilized. And it was interesting that after the BRICS meeting, the most advanced of these is the so-called M-Bridge, which is between China, Hong Kong, Thailand, the United Arab Emirates, and now Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And the BAS, post the BRICS meeting and the comments that Putin made, has now said that they're sort of withdrawing and then they're letting this pilot is ready. They don't need to get involved anymore. It's going forward. But bear in mind that when you talk about crypto versus central bank digital currencies, there is a big difference, which is certainly very much on the mind of the authoritarian regimes. China, in particular, has banned crypto, has absolutely no intention of using or allowing decentralized digital assets to be part of the system. And also, China doesn't really, China's interest is to promote the RMB and to trade as much as possible in its own currency, rather than sort of come into a block and have a particular other currency being created. And so then, if all those BRIC countries need to or want to transact between themselves in their own currency rather than using the dollar as an intermediary, they'll have a huge incentive in terms of even cost savings to do these transactions in the kind of global payment system of the 21st century. And the US has been behind the curve in creating a similar structure. And actually under Trump, who has said that, he's against central bank digital currencies, that side of the US effort is likely to diminish. So it's a very interesting dichotomy between how the authoritarian regimes will use digital currencies, how the free liberal democracies may or may not use central bank digital currencies, and where crypto fits into all this.
Right.
And it's not inconceivable that it ends up being really a third pole in this interaction.
Well, I think that seems to be the direction that BRICS has taken, along with other, countries within it. They announced their proposal to create a global crypto investment platform. That, of course, also involves Xi Jinping talking about with China as well as Russia. And another thing within it, they've got BRICS Pay. We've done a full video on BRICS Pay and what that might look like. You mentioned a little bit about M-Bridge, the involvement with Ripple on being able to do cross-border settlements. Back to the point of where crypto could be involved, I think that in conjunction with what they're trying to do right now which is really getting into a lot of these cross-border crypto transactions. Now, whether or not we see Bitcoin continuing to flow into nation states, and we may see that now, if you look at the number of countries that currently hold this asset, could we see this maybe start to rise, to your point, as a third pole to be looking at in the global infrastructure in terms of fundings in general? Do you think that with all of that being said, that the potential for BRICS to kind of lead that way? Or do you think it might come from other countries around the world starting to look at what the United States is doing around a Bitcoin strategic reserve?
So we'll see how that strategy shapes under Trump. I think it's too early to speculate exactly where Trump will go with this. And he certainly has also stated that he will penalize other countries that try and move away from the US dollar, again with tariffs. We'll see how that moves. But I think it's important to realize that, and a lot of the reporting tends to conflate a lot of these issues into one and the same thing. A crypto, first of all, is really looked at much more as an asset rather than as a means of payment.
Right.
And when it comes to means of payment, again, central bank digital currencies and cross-border payments based on using central bank digital currencies will offer tremendous cost and efficiency gains, but the system embridge is, and certainly from the Chinese point of view in terms of how their digital currency is set up, is very much a centralized, not a decentralized system. And none of the authoritarian regimes really have an incentive to not take the same position, if you see what I mean, to release control. That's not in their nature. So any talk about crypto is more in the sense of potentially as an alternative asset class.
Right.
And when it comes to means of payment, we are using distributed ledger technologies to improve, what is really an antiquated system globally. That takes, days to move money across. And actually where a lot of the small economies are being disadvantaged because post the global financial crisis, the US really kind of cut its global correspondent banking network, which is an integral part of that global payment system.
Yeah, I think I look at it, in the sense of where stablecoins could really flow into this. Whether you look at Tether, you look at what Ripple is doing with their stablecoin, obviously Circle here in the United States. Now Bitcoin is now past Saudi Aramco, and it's very early in terms of the overall adoption curve. I was also looking at the amount of Bitcoin currently being held by countries. Not a lot of major countries on here other than the US and China and the United Kingdom that are holding a fairly significant amount, but it's the rising countries that could be starting to play out, at least in this curve between this challenge between the US and China. So I think that's something that is probably going to play into this. But stablecoins and everything that we'll see, including a lot of the legislation that's come in the EU around MiCA, do you think that shifts any of the focus over to stablecoins, especially with the number of them that are available? Because every country could develop their own stablecoin. What about going that route instead of a CBDC?
I think that is really much more to the preference of the free liberal democratic world. So I see that, and in fact, I would argue that the response, I grew up in communism, in communist Bulgaria. I was in my, teenage years, 14, when the Berlin Wall fell. And so I remember what it was like. And, I certainly don't want to personally live in communism ever again. I mean, if others want to, that's their choice. That's fine. But it's been very frustrating that the sort of free liberal democratic world is responding to the Chinese challenge by kind of swinging in the direction of employing similar measures and tactics, whether it's industrial policy and liberal or deliberalizing and turning more into being like those regimes in order to be able to compete. And in my view, it will be better that we double down on our values in order to compete with the authoritarian regimes in this kind of loosely banded grouping. And in that sense, this is where I see the role of stable coins.
Yeah, I definitely would say that that's what we're seeing in terms of a lot of the countries, both leaders, the direction we've seen obviously with digital assets, but also the advancement of how, how speedy these transactions can go and what that means for a lot of these countries that are emerging. I want to play a clip here from Pompliano where he's talking about the current case of Bitcoin and how this affects the rest of the world. Take a look.
He holds Bitcoin. He also wants the United States to hold Bitcoin. And so he's going to put together this strategic reserve of Bitcoin, which will be incredibly important. I think it'll be a flag that he plants in the ground and says, hey, I promised I was going to do this, and I did in the first 100 days.
Why is that a big deal? If you have a strategic reserve, you're building it, and by having to buy Bitcoin to have in it, right? So it furthers the demand.
Well, central banks around the world, they hold gold, many other assets.
Right.
And so anytime that you can go and get the best store of value asset in Bitcoin, which it has been for the last 15 years, I think that's a good thing. The other thing that's happening is Bitcoin's price is increasing, and everyone says, hey, it's Wall Street FOMO, which definitely is playing into it. But I think that Bitcoin,
right?
But I think that Bitcoin is also a global alarm system. And what Bitcoin is telling us is, I'm calling the bluff of the politicians. If we go and look over the last 3 months, the politicians have added $850 billion to the national debt. And so at that same point, over that 3-month period, Bitcoin is up over 40%. And so right now we have a race between the national debt and Bitcoin. Who is going to reach the sky faster?
So with that being said, you look at obviously the situation we're faced with here in the United States, very high deficit. Our interest rate alone is getting to the point where it's not manageable. The likelihood of an alternative system, whether it's a strategic Bitcoin reserve or other scenario that plays into this, and then a global adoption curve. When you look at all of that coming together at the same time, would that put you in a position where you would say, okay, maybe now, if you look at the future, this could be something that could start to shift the global economic power structure, even if you pushed China out of a digital currency and China was forced to deal with another global reserve currency starting to take hold. Instead of the yuan, it could be something like a Bitcoin or a stable coin. Your thoughts?
Well, I'll make it even broader for you because, the question, sort of big thinking, forward-looking question that I'm asking myself is, in particular, also when I take the various surveys around the Ukraine war, that actually individuals trusted their company more than they trusted their national governments in how, in sort of, their behavior and what is right and what is wrong. So we have this separation between and lack of trust of the individual in the free liberal, again, democratic world with respect to their leaders and how well they're doing their job. And then you have this payment system that is entirely, and it's, as I keep saying, it's, when it comes to Bitcoin, it's really, we're talking about assets here, not means of payment. Of course, the stable coin is means of payment as well. And it's an alternative system that also bands together different nationalities. It's a very supranational kind of movement that on the US side, it very much is in response to deteriorated faith in the prudent monetary management of the US economy that's been, perennially behind the increase in Bitcoin over time. And those worries have gotten worse rather than better, or rather than less. But the question I wonder is it going to be the world bifurcating into two systems, a US-led and a China-led one, or while those are having their own problems and maybe not managing to bring everyone in all of their populations together, especially in the free world where the populations have more freedom to express their desires properly, then we create something that is not attached to a nation.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the point. To your point, you hit on a couple of good topics there. The key thing is the mistrust that we're seeing, not only here in the U.S., but really around the world. I mean, a lot of emerging countries have already developed with this. We've seen in Venezuela. Obviously, we've seen many countries that have already dealt with this. Argentina is now going through this. You're going to see this most likely in the European nations, all of which are kind of aligning to this one national, I should say, supranational approach that's been happening. And maybe that's what China was fearful of when they banned crypto mining, back in 2021. We saw them detach away because it was becoming a little bit too powerful for them to control. China is still one of the largest countries in terms of amount of trades originating out into crypto is still happening within the country of China. So it's interesting to see that even the people of China are continuing to move outside the lines as well. So it's going to be one to watch for sure. Diana, it's been great having you on today. Thank you so much for coming in. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Excellent. All right, you guys, if you're not tuned in over on the YouTube channel, make sure and join us here. Of course, get into the Diamond Circle. It's a great place to get additional content. Follow me out there on X at Paul Barron. We'll catch you next time right here on TechPath.